I'm here with Leon Aron, the Director of Russia Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, to talk about your new book called Roads to the Temple: Truth, Memory, Ideas, and Ideals in the Making of the Russian Revolution, 1987 to 1991. I always think it's useful to start with an author by talking about, asking him, how did this book come to be? What is it that prompted you to write this book? And then we'll get more into the substance of the book. But how did you come to sit down and say, I'm going to put 300-400 pages down on this topic?
Well, usually, when authors do it in retrospect, everything seems to be, very logical. One morning I got up, oh boy, this. But of course, I don't know. I don't know of anybody, and certainly my experience has been totally different. In the end, the book. It changes, it grows. The metaphor I like to use is the metaphor used by a great Russian literary critic, Viktor Shklovsky. He said it's like a baby. So I think my first impulse. I think authors should talk about first impulses. My first impulse was, because prior to that, I wrote, actually at that time, the first fundamental scholarly biography of Boris Yeltsin, and I realized how much was left on the cutting floor. Because, I concentrated on the man, and of course I tried to give, as in any good biography, obviously it's a man and his times. But I remember, like almost to the point of tears, throwing out, because you can't, it's already a huge book. I could not stuff it with all this marvelous stuff that I discovered along while I was writing the biography. In other words, I felt that there was a history of ideas there, but I could only get into it, in a very, very minimal way. So the first impulse was, I need to go back and first check, is my impression correct? Are those the riches, the brilliance that I remember, or maybe I'm just wrong and there's nothing there? So that was I think probably the first impulse, and the second one was the mystery of the Soviet collapse.
You write, overall in 1985 to 1987, the Soviet Union was at the height of its world power and influence, and yet just a few years later, this enormous empire at the height of its influence was gone.
That's the mystery I'm referring to, and this, by the way, is the quote from probably one of the classic political historians of the Soviet Union, the late Professor Adam Ulam of Harvard, whose book is, I think it's called Expansion and Coexistence on Soviet Foreign Policy, is a classic. He's absolutely right, and that was a second motivating factor. I felt that, there must have been something else. There was no, after all, there was no epidemic, there was no flood, there was no earthquake, there was no war, there was no rebellion, there was no starvation. In other words, all the classic factors that we continue, by the way, look at, or any kind of institutional debilitation, or the split of the elites. What split? There was no split in '85. Everybody was ready to march under the red banner for decades. So all these things that we as political scientists or political sociologists consider key factors in the germination of revolution did not seem to be there. So what was it?
So all these traditionally sort of material factors that if we're looking at a precipitating cause for such an enormous event as the collapse of the Soviet Union, that did not present itself. So you started, well, not at that time, I think it was somewhere in your mind before that, but you said, well, we need to look at something else that was going on at that time.
Precisely, and that is, that I think I was telling myself that, so that, this exercise in a retrieval of these brilliant ideas and brilliant essays, was not sort of just a self-indulgent exercise that I will actually do something scholarly here and explain the revolution. Although I must say that that's what history of ideas is all about. In fact, they don't always lead to revolution. It's always a thin line that you travel as a scholar between the ideas and their impact. It's never one-to-one. This is not a scientific experiment. But But the history of ideas is clearly, and it's somewhat neglected now in the academia, but I think the greatest explanations and the most fascinating explanations of human behavior come from these types of histories.
So you went and you looked at in this period in the late 1980s, between 1987 and 1991, magazine articles, newspaper articles, documentaries that were being made, these pamphlets that were being written, any form of communication. There was this incredible ferment of ideas and debate and argument that was going on, and that's what you looked at to explain what might have driven this dramatic change.
Exactly. That's what I looked at, and again, I don't think anybody's done it before. And
this was all entirely new to me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's somebody who lived through that period, and so. But this is all extremely new. I mean, nobody at least has presented this to a Western audience.
It's good to hear, very gratifying, and that's the reaction I get from all kinds of other reviews, or when I speak to people. Some people say, well, first of all, we didn't know there was a revolution. The usual shorthand is the Soviet Union's collapse. Well, Cuba is not collapsing, North Korea is not collapsing, everybody's starving, but it's not collapsing. And it's not collapsing because, well, the answer is in the book. Because the first thing that Mikhail Gorbachev did after he decided that something other than growth and productivity is the problem.
So there was awareness on the part of Gorbachev and the people around him that it wasn't just that the economy wasn't working, or it was certainly true that its economy wasn't working, but there was something much bigger, more fundamental that needed to be addressed.
And in fact, it only came out in their memoirs, because I think even at the time, being good Marxists that they were, all that mattered to them was, well, how are we doing in productivity vis-a-vis the United States? What is our milk yield per cow? What is our wheat crop? But then when you look, and I think they were unself-conscious about this, when you look at their memoirs, like former Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze telling Gorbachev, this is all rotten. I mean, I think I mentioned this in the book, and I'm saying I don't think they were talking about yield per cow. I mean, I think they felt that there was something fundamentally immoral about the regime, but they could not put their finger on it. And incidentally, they felt that it's easily recoverable and easily cured. I mean, not in their wildest dreams. They thought that they were precipitating a revolution. They thought, and again, I believe I mentioned this in the book, they thought that they could pursue something that would be moral, but also would be okay by the regime. The previous generations of communist leaders would never do it. I mean, the survival of the regime was the key. But these were kind of princelings. I mean, these are the boys to whom it was all given in the 70s, when the Soviet Union was at the height of their power. And they felt, yeah, you could tinker a little bit. I mean, what bad could come from loosening the censorship just a bit? And they did. And the rest is history.
And this was the beginning of glasnost. You wrote, rarely, if ever, in its 1,000-year history, was Russia as honest with herself as in the years 1987 to 1991. That gives a flavor of just how dramatic this, at this very small window of time, was in terms of questioning, Russians being able for the first time to question their government and their way of life and how their society was structured, and real first principles. And it gives a sense of the dramatic nature of what was going on at the time. I start a chapter, I think it's chapter 2, by simply quoting the witnesses. And some of them said, it's like a flow of oxygen to a mine where we were, essentially dying of suffocation, where we were suffocating. Others felt that it's like taking a rusting chains of, it was in a very, very physical way. The destruction of these lying edifice imposed on their minds and wills by this relentless, and it's not just censorship in the Western way. It's not like some editor somewhere sits and crosses out a few adjectives. But by the censorship they meant, and I mean, is the enforcement of a very rigid idea
of what their life was, what their life is and will be, and the life in the outside world. In fact, everything was very regimented. And after a while, you know, obviously the people felt that this was becoming suffocating. And I think in the end, that's probably what Gorbachev felt as well.